Well, this is part 2 of chapter 8. And again, these PowerPoints have links and the videos are really helpful. And some of them are actually, I've heard, mildly entertaining. They do introduce you to a lot of very current research that's addressing a lot of issues in Western medicine right now. So we just finished prokaryotes, and now we're going to move into the eukaryotic domain. And this is where students sometimes get these confused. Protists sound like prokaryote, but the protist kingdom is in the eukaryotic domain. Prokaryotes are bacteria. So write that down, do something underlining or bolding of a word so you don't confuse those two. So again, just keep reviewing as you go through these. What does it mean to be eukaryotic? It means you have a true nucleus, membrane-bound nucleus with a double DNA helix as opposed to a plasmid in a bacteria in the prokaryotic domain. Protists are unique. One, the protist kingdom is kind of bizarre. It's the junk drawer. They throw things in here when they don't fit. There's a lot of animal-like and a lot of plant-like organisms in here. I'm going to ask you to learn how they reproduce, consumer, producer, decomposer, all those, and as far as, and some infectious forms of these. So not really running off 20 different examples of protists. I'm not going to do that. The one thing is they're almost all single celled. And when you're a single cell on its own, it's very at the whim of nature. They have to have a very narrow niche. We can go without water for days. We can go without food for months. Our cells can sacrifice and work together as a unit known as a body in order that the organism still lives. But if you're just a single-celled organism, you don't really have much to go on. So these things are typically in fresh water, not all of them, but a lot of them in fresh water, definitely in water, or a very, very humid environment. If they are not in water or they're in inhospitable environments, they form cysts. We're going to talk about that. So water, definitely need water, definitely single-celled for the most part. They reproduce asexually and sexually. You can see down here in the bottom right is a paramecium going through binary fission. Make sure you understand that binary fission is asexual. A means without the exchange of gametes. We take the word sex and we run with it, right? Sex means the exchange of female and male gametes. So it's for procreation of the species. We've ruined all those words. They don't even make sense anymore. So you have slime molds here. Now, none of these are specifically pathogenic. I mean, some of these protists and fungus can be pathogenic to someone without a really healthy immune system. So it will just depend on the person. But these aren't necessarily pathogenic. These are just examples. These slime molds can live in your shower, on your shower screen, on your tub. Usually the slippery stuff, that's not soap. Soap wouldn't be slippery after it's dried, or it's kind of holding a little bit of humidity there. That's typically an organism. It's a slime mold that can go into some kind of dormancy, and then once water hits it again, it can revive. And there's some video links here too if you're interested. That slime mold link is so neat. It's about using slime molds because they pulse to control robots. I can't make this up. I was surprised when I saw that. So producer, consumer, or decomposer. Well, Euglena is an example of a photosynthesizing protist. Paramecium is a consumer. Most all species of those are consumers. They're heterotrophs. And they do some decomposition. Off the top of my head, I can't think, but I know there's some in the kingdom that do that. So all three of those. This is how they form cysts when they're in inhospitable conditions. This is giardiasis, but the brain amoeba does that as well. Now here are some pathogenic. Pathos means death or disease. Genesis means to create. So to create death or disease. So pathogenic protist. This is a sleeping sickness disease caused by a protist that's delivered by a fly. This is malaria. You've heard of this. And the drug that treats it. I won't go into that one. So this, you can see in the background, these are red blood cells. So this is probably 400 magnification. So these are pretty large organisms relative to single-celled organisms. And malaria is spread by a mosquito, as you probably know, and sleeping sickness is spread by a fly. This is giardiasis. You see, they make the genus just one letter and then the species, and then sometimes it has another taxonomic name. These are usually found in fresh water and cause dysentery. There was an outbreak in America, I think it was Milwaukee or somewhere, and it killed people who were compromised, comorbidities or older. So, but for the typical, in American hospitals, you go and you get IV fluids and you just keep going to the bathroom until all of the organisms have shed. And the trick is just keeping you hydrated. But you can understand that you can't drink water because your large intestine's letting all the water out of your body. So if you drank it, it would just go back out again. So if you were to get one of these diseases in an area where you can't get IV fluids, you die of dehydration within 24, 48 hours. That's how quickly they can kill you by dehydrating you. And brain-eating amoeba, that's another link. That's linked to Monsters Inside of Me. Crazy show. I forget what station it was on, but there are clips on YouTube for it. But that was in Lake Weir. I don't know if they're still having a problem, but they go dormant in cysts, and then they come out when the weather gets really hot. And then the water upwells because of the convergence and the heating of the water on the top layer, and then swapping with the cold water in the bottom layer. And then they come to the surface and you can be infected with them. It's when you're in the water for a very long period of time, and the mucous membrane they go up your nose, not your ear, it's your nose, unless you have a hole in your eardrum. They go up your nose, and then they touch your nerve because the mucus has worn away from the olfactory, almost forgot the name of it, the olfactory nerve in the nose, and they can enter your brain that way. So fungi, you can see we're just covering the basics. We're covering reproduction, we're covering pathogenesis, and their ecological relationships. So you've probably seen one of these, especially in Florida when it's raining a lot. They call it fairy ring. First thing you have to understand when you're looking at a mushroom, you're looking at such a small part of the fungus. It's only the reproductive structure. So we don't need to make an analogy to a human now, do we? We can pretty much use our imagination, but that's all you're seeing is the reproduction structure of the organism. It comes up when conditions are favorable, and then they blow the spores out from under their caps in their gills, and then they reproduce that way. And they're more related to animals because they're heterotrophs. They do not photosynthesize. They're heterotrophs and they're decomposers. And they do. The first finding of an antibiotic was penicillin from bread mold. And it came out of something he was eating, and it fell on the petri dish, and then they found a zone of intolerance around the bacteria where the bread mold had fell, showing that there was something in that mold that was making a chemical that was killing off the bacteria in that zone. And that's how they got penicillin. Some people are allergic. I have a mild allergy to it. Some people are highly allergic to penicillin. But it was one of the first mass-produced antibiotics. It used to be in wars, if you got shot and you didn't die, you would have died of infection because we didn't have antibiotics at that time. It was World War II, if I believe, that they were mass-produced and made available and saved millions of lives before they had sulfur drugs and amputation, and civil wars before germ theory. And they were taking scalpels from one necrotic, gangrenous leg to another without even cleaning it because we didn't know. I mean, think about that. During the Civil War, we didn't know that germs were carried microscopically. It's insane. In just 150, 170 years, it's pretty crazy. So they do reproduce by spores. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. And down here is an image of what I was talking about. So this mushroom part is reproductive structure. And this is the hyphae is singular and mycelium is plural. So one thread would be a hyphae, however you want to pronounce it, doesn't matter. The whole thing, the whole organism is mycelium. And then they, on right conditions, they grow up and form a reproductive structure, and then the spores come out from under the caps. So that's the vocabulary is talking about. And there are some diseases, most fungal diseases that human immune system can fight off most. It's usually when you're immunocompromised that you have an issue with a fungus. You've been getting chemo treatments or HIV, or somehow your immune system's compromised. But we can fight off most of them. Now we have a problem like annoying diseases like athlete's foot. You can see a picture here. But the thing is, so here is the athlete's foot blown up 400 to 800 magnification. And these threads, these hyphae, are growing into the skin, but they're not growing into the living skin. They're growing into the 30 dead layers of skin you have on your body. And what they're doing is emitting enzymes and acid onto the dead skin. They're actually an amazing exfoliant, for those of you who know what that means for beauty. They exfoliate your skin, but they do it all the way down to the basal layer to the point where it itches. When a wound is healing, it itches because the very highly mitotic cells at the basal layer where new skin cells are made are reproducing at a really high rate, and that causes the itching because blood flow is going there. But it's not necessarily threatening to your life. You can have that. You can get some in if you like tear your skin or something, but for the most part, they're just going to eat dead skin and liquefy their food and drink it. It's pretty gross. So we do use it in food, and I'm sure you're probably already thinking along the lines of this. So bread, but we don't. It's not necessarily that we eat it. We use it for flavoring. We use it to make carbon dioxide to make the bread rise. So yeah, when yeast use the sugars in the bread to make carbon dioxide and ethanol, which they do, but in bread, the ethanol is cooked out and evaporated, so you don't get drunk eating bread. But you can use it in brewing, and so when people drink alcohol, they're drinking the excrement of a yeast. That sounded great. And if you drink something heavier, like a wine or a liquor, those either have to be fermented longer, or an additive given to it, or distillation. So they distillate all the water out, or they distillate off the ethanol because the ethanol evaporates at a lower temperature, and they catch it, and then that goes through a series of cooling coils into a container, and then that is the liquor. And then what remains in what they were boiling is the original water and any kind of impurities. So yeast cannot make vodka. You have to let it ferment, whatever you're going to use, and then distill it. It's a whole nother process. Yeast make beer, mead, and wine, depending on what sugar you're giving it. Wine is grapes, beer is barley, something like that, malt from the sugars in the grain, and then mead would be from honey. But those are all directly fermented products of yeast. And they're mostly multi-celled. Yeast is the only single-celled, I shouldn't say it's the only one, it's the main one that we talk about and would be in any average textbook. Now here's a lichen that you've seen a lot in Florida. This is a moss underneath it. Don't confuse that. The green part's a moss. That's a non-vascular plant that we're going to get to later. The grayish green looking stuff is a lichen, and a lichen is a perfect example of symbiosis. So the lichen is a fungus and an algae. Okay, so it's a decomposer and a photosynthesizer. It's beautiful because they can make energy all the time. And you'll see them on bark because bark's dead. You'll see them on rocks, and you're thinking, what are they eating? Well, they could be eating, they're probably overtaking that moss or any other kind of dead detritus that's on there, because that's what the fungus can eat. You see, they can live almost anywhere because they can photosynthesize and decompose. So it's a perfect relationship. And now we're into plants. You can see how quickly we go through this. Again, we're just looking at how they reproduce. Most all are asexual and sexual. Their niche in nature, what are their ecological role, and pathogenic, or any kind of other attribute, like with yeast or fungus, it was brewing and bread making. So plants, hopefully a lot of this slide is a review, and if it's not, you really got to dig back into chapter 5. So right away, you know we're going to talk about chloroplasts, because that makes plants plants. Plants are photosynthesizers, and that's why they are put in that kingdom. So chloroplasts are the organelle that allows for photosynthesis. And remember, in the organelle, you have so there is a plant cell. The rectangle is a cell. Remember, the cell wall is made of cellulose. These little green discs in there are the chloroplasts. So this is not a cell, this is a chloroplast. One big rectangle is a cell. And the discs are granum, plural, or thylakoid membrane, whatever you want to remember it as. That's where the light reactions happen. And in the green gelatinous fluid surrounding the discs, remember the pancakes and syrup, the syrup part is the stroma. And that is where the dark reactions take place, where the enzyme rubisco puts the H, split from water, with the CO2, take it in through the leaves, through the stomates, to make glucose, C6H12O6. So that's a handy little review. And we're going to go into the organization of plants. So the first part, you have non-vascular, and I just showed you moss on the other slide with the lichen. These are non-vascular. They do not grow tall. They do not have vascular tissue. Remember that from chapter 5, xylem and phloem. So they need a lot of water. They can only survive if there's water. They can only reproduce if there's water. That's about as much as you got to know about non-vascular. Moss is an example, not Spanish moss. Spanish moss is not a moss. Spanish moss is an angiosperm. We'll get to that. but a true moss, so the short little green plants that grows on rocks and on the ground. And then you have vascular. Remember, if you remember which one goes up and down, phloem takes the food down, takes the sugars made in the leaves by the chloroplast down to the roots to be anabolized into starch. Xylem takes the water up through the roots, through the leaves for photosynthesis, and out the stomates as a vacuum. Here's a picture of it if you cut a log. You have the dead wood in the middle, that's the heartwood. You have the dead bark on the outside, and then you have the cambium in here, and that is the phloem and the xylem. The xylem is mislabeled. The xylem would be way out here in this cambium layer. You can see it underlined right here. That's how thin the actual living part of a tree is. Now they vary species to species, but that's how thin the cambium is. Pioneers used to girdle a tree by cutting in an inch or two all the way around it. That would cut off the xylem and phloem, kind of like putting a tourniquet on your arm. And then eventually the tree would die and it'd be easier to cut down. It's called girdling. But the heartwood, anything in the middle of a tree is dead. That's why a tree can be alive once it gets hit with lightning, because the living part's on the outside. And there's another picture of it if you need to see that angle. So here's an image. It just hit me when I saw it. And I thought, wow, that is helpful. So hopefully you're catching what you're looking at here. I mean, most everybody's like, oh, I get the one on the left. That's a tree. And the one on the right is your lungs turned upside down. Your bronchial tree. So you have the trachea here, and then they break off into bronchioles. Bronchial tree, get it? And then they break off. You can't even see the alveoli. The alveoli are microscopic. They're so small. But think about it now. You've got all these leaves, which increase the what? Remember the course theme? Surface area to volume ratio? Increase the surface area for what? Diffusion of gases. Well, the same goes for the alveoli and the lungs. It increases the surface area for diffusion of gases. Remember, your lungs would have to be the size of a tennis court if your lungs are just 2 bags. They're not 2 bags. They're full of all these alveoli. So you got diffusion as a concept, surface area as a course theme, cellular respiration as a concept, photosynthesis as a concept. So you got vascular tissues for plants and organization. So keep running these through. When you look at a diagram, really make your brain, give it a workout, and think about, I might only be talking about these things on this slide, but you can make your mind do mental gymnastics and keep working through the vocabulary and try to think of all the things that slide could apply to, especially when we get to chapter 9. So here is probably the trickiest part of plants, alternation of generations. But if you hang with me, you're going to see that this really isn't hard. You can make it as hard as you want. It's kind of like osmosis. You can learn osmosis any way you want. If you stick with me and do the water always moves towards the hypertonic area instead of all the other ways of learning it, it's going to be a lot easier. And I'm going to give you that same kind of quick, to the point reason why some textbooks take 2 pages on this. And I'm going to do it in a slide. So first diagram, stop, don't move. Look at this diagram. So you see a lot of things that you already know. You know what mitosis is. You know what meiosis is. You know what fertilization is. You know what a gamete is. So don't look at this like, deer in the headlights. Try to pick through it. Now pick through it and look at what's different. Okay, look what's different here. So you see, oh, I see the word sporophyte up here. Well, okay, that's different. But you do see the word diploid, and you do see 2N, that's normal. And then down here you see gamete, you see phyte, so we're talking about plants, and you see haploid. So that's the same. You see a zygote. You were once a zygote when you were conceived. So one of the real differences is the gamete is multicelled. Do you see that? So gametes in humans are not multicelled. They're single-celled. That's one of the biggest ones about alternation of generations. So in plants, the gametophyte can actually be visible. You can't, some people, oh, you can see a human egg. Well, you better have good eyesight, and I would suggest a magnifying glass. But you definitely can't see one human sperm, and that's a gamete. So let's just go there. I had a student make an argument like that once. So here's a diagram. Looks really noisy, but slow down again. Look for what you know. Okay, so you see the meiosis. You can pick out the mitosis. You can pick out, you saw sporophyte earlier. Now I'm going to point out some things. So you see that line going down to both of those. So you see a male and a female gametophyte. We are not going to get into the nitty gritty that there's male and female plants, or some plants have male and female parts on the same plant. We're not going to do that. It's called monoecious and dioecious. I'm not doing that. What I want you to get is that the gametophyte part of a plant, number one, is multicelled. Number two, it's viewable. You can see it with your naked eye. You can hold it in your hand. And number three, they fall off and grow back, and fall off and grow back. And you might think, well, so what? Well, think about you. Your sexual reproductive structures do not fall off and grow back. So hang on to that. Think about that. That's why they have to, that's one of the huge differences when it comes to plants and reproduction. So it's a whole generation. I mean, just think of a tree common in Florida. Think of a pine tree, right, in this image. So here is your sporophyte. The tree is the sporophyte. The pine cone is the gametophyte. Now are you starting to get it? So do pine trees have pine cones all the time? No, they grow them all. Then and you have male pine cones and female pine cones, as you can see. And the male pine cone usually is really, really small compared to the female pine cone. They call the male pine cone a microspore and a microstrobilus, and then they call the female pine cone megastrobilus. So the woody pine cone you're used to seeing is the female. You probably don't even notice the male pine cone unless you're really looking. So they actually have to grow, and they're on the tree for a couple of months. They pollinate, the male pollinates, and then once the female, well, at a certain time, no matter if it's fertilized or not, it'll fall to the ground, and then the seeds can break open, and fire usually helps with that, and then you'll have a whole new generation. So the biggest thing is, I'll go through them one more time. These gametophytes are viewable because they're multicelled. Our gametophytes are not multicelled. Second thing, they're viewable and they fall off. Okay. The other thing is that you have a sporophyte generation. So think about, this is so weird if you really think about this. So this would be you. The pine tree would be you. And then only when you want to reproduce would you grow any sexual reproductive structures. And then when you're done reproducing, they fall off again. I mean, that's how weird this is. So it really is a concept to get down. So this pine tree is the sporophyte. So if I ask you, what is a pine tree? You're going to say sporophyte. If I ask you what a pine cone is, you're going to say gametophyte. Because the pine cones are not always on the tree. They lose them and they have to grow them all back again. Now try to apply that example to an oak tree. It's the same principle, and hopefully you know oak trees have acorns. So here's a diagram. You don't have to know the whole diagram, mainly this top part here. But it kind of helps you work through simple plants up to really complex plants. And it gives your mind an organizational scheme. So you have algae and phytoplankton that float around in the oceans, and they don't even really need an anchor. You know, some do, like kelp, eelgrass in the springs, things like that. But you have some that just float. That's what plankton means, just floating. But they're very basic plants. Then you can say, okay, they came out on land. What do they need? They need a waxy cuticle to protect from drying out because they're not in water all the time. They need bark. They need roots. They need xylem and phloem. They need leaves. You know, they need all these protective things, and even spikes and different things as they try to get into different climates and niches in the environment. So you can see these non-vascular, I said no moss. As you get more and more complex, you can see now they get vascular tissues, ferns, but they're still a pretty simple plant. They have sporophytes, sori under their leaves. And then you get more complex and you have the seed plants. So conifers are gymnosperms. They're naked seed. They don't have any flesh. And what do I mean by flesh? Well, think of a flowering plant like a peach tree or a tomato. So they have flesh around their seed, and we eat that flesh. That sounds kind of gross, but naked seeds are like cedars and pine cones, things like that, pines. And then flowering would be anything like an apple or a peach or a pear or a tomato. And yes, a tomato is a fruit. Please don't get me started on that. Okay, so gymnosperm means naked seed. Sperm means seed. Gymno, gymnastics, naked. Yes, the Greeks used to do the Olympics and work out in the gymnasium naked. They named it naked, the naked place. Talk to somebody that teaches humanities about that. That would be a hoot. And then Angie, think Angie likes flowers. So angiosperms are flowering plants. And typically, how we're going to cover it in this class, angiosperms, a vessel. So the pollen will grow down into the vessel, into the ovary, and make a fruit, make flesh. So just think Angie likes flowers, and Gymno means naked. And here's a good picture of a female cone, the big woody one, and you can see the male little tiny size of your pinky cones over here, and they're the microstobilus. But it is both of these are the what of the plant, the gametophyte. The pine tree is the sporophyte. Here is an angiosperm. This is a dioecious, so it has male and female. The female's in the middle, and all the multiple men surround her and worship her and tell her how awesome she is. So these are the anthers, and they're going to let release the pollen. The pollen could go to another flower, or it could land on the top of the stigma and grow all the way down into the ovary. So it's not over yet. And we did gametophyte and sporophyte. So again, use this picture here. The cones are the gametophyte, and the pine tree is the sporophyte. Over here, this flower would be the gametophyte, and whatever the plant was that grew this flower, if it was a peach tree, the tree would be the sporophyte. So male and female, we kind of walk through those. Stigma, carpel is the female, and then the stamen with the anthers, get it, antler, deer, I don't know, are the male parts. You don't have to memorize this diagram, but you can kind of work through it and see this is all the gametophyte. This is all this diagram is talking about. It's not even addressing the plant itself of the sporophyte. But you don't have to know those. I just put that on there for diagram's sake. So that's a tulip, and that's the ovule at the center of the tulip flower. And you can see some of the other remaining parts of the male with the stigma. And they would have to grow down in the ovule to pollinate it. And here is, so this is a pollen here at the very end, and this is the tube that grows, and then the genes are sent through that tube, kind of like conjugation and transformation in a bacteria, but more advanced. And here's another picture of it. So this is the center here, and then the pollen tube lands here on the top of the stigma and grows down in and fertilizes it. And then, of course, you have a, oh, amoeba sisters. I almost had a mental moment there. So pulling up the PowerPoints, and maybe just on a day where you're having a real tough time, just focusing, just watch some of these, and sometimes this is what you'll remember on the test. But yeah, that's why when you see the seeds in tomatoes, and it's so interesting that they do all that work just to get those seeds out there. The seeds are fertilized, and the flesh is for its survival. It's not necessarily for us to eat, but that's how we look at it anyway, right? It's for the reproduction of the plant, not necessarily to feed humans. And this is obviously what you see. A bee got tricked into pollinating plants. These are some pretty cool video links if you want to click on those in the PowerPoint. So this is purple parts, the pollen, and then after it's stimulated to grow the tube, it grows the tube. So now you're starting to get that green stuff all over your car is pine tree sperm. And here is they tagged a bunch of pollen with a fluorescent dye, and then they left time-lapse photography, and they all landed up here on the top of the stigma and grew down in to the ovule. And this is something that might simplify it, but maybe a little bit simplified. So angiosperm, vessel seed, the pollen lands there, grows in, and then you can obviously see the resemblance of the tomato. You can see the sepal and everything here, and how it came about from the flower. Gymnosperm, it would be naked seed. In other words, you wouldn't have a tomato, you wouldn't have a peach flesh around it. It would be like a pine tree cone, something without any flesh, edible flesh around it. And the last slide of this presentation is just kind of a wake-up call for anybody that has animals, and it doesn't matter if it's a dog, cat, goat, cow, horse. These trees, even though they're, you know, I guess Floridian looking and dinosaur looking, they're a sago palm. You might know them as, or cycads. And I had some in my yard until I found this out. Here is the seed pod once this thing starts quote unquote flowering. And these orange seeds in the middle, if a cat or a dog or animal gets curious and eats them, it'll shut down their kidneys over a period of days. And typically it's irreversible because you don't catch it until you see symptoms. And once you see the symptoms, it's too late. And it's a very unfun death, and it's very expensive. So the best thing to do is either cordon these plants off or sell them. And on different outlets, you can get a lot of money for these plants if you know where you're going. And they're easy to dig, relatively easy to dig up too. So you just don't want to take the chance that an animal could get a hold of them, and they don't have to eat them. All they have to do is chew on them and get some of the chemical in their mouth, because your blood supply is very rich in your mouth, under your tongue, and around your gums. And that's all it takes for it to get into the blood supply. It's a very small dosage, and you can read that on the ASPCA site.